Well, hello, happy Friday. It's 1:30. Welcome to KKMC. My name is William Hemsworth, and this is Deep in Church History. Thank you for joining me today. Hope you've had a great week. I know it's a busy time of year. We got the hustle and bustle of Christmas. By the way, happy Advent. Merry Christmas. Christmas is on Tuesday. Can you believe that? So Merry Christmas to you, to your family. Praying for all of you. I ask you keep me in your prayers as well. And so what I want to do today is I want to take a step back here. I was going to finish up the Didache today. I'm going to finish that off in the new year. This is the time of year where Scripture is attacked, where Jesus is attacked. And it's really strange because it's a time of year where generally people are nicer to each other, and in some ways it's actually easier to share the gospel. But a lot of ways, all those people that say, that the Bible isn't, that the Bible's false, that Jesus never existed, they come out of the woodwork during Christmas and Easter. And so I read an article on Facebook last week pretty much denouncing the Gospels as myth, even though they are historical documents. And in particular, this article was trashing the Gospel of John, saying, that it was written later than the other ones, which it was. No one's denying that. But because it's so different than the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that it's not real, that it shouldn't, that it elevates Jesus to where he shouldn't be, because John generally has what they call a high Christology. And so what I want to do over the course of today's show is discuss the authorship of John's Gospel. I would go through some of the theories about who wrote it and why I believe that John the Apostle wrote it, John the Beloved. And these kind of theories, they started coming to fruition in the 19th century with the rise of liberal theology. So, the Gospel of John it's a treasure to believers. It mentions events that occurred in the synoptics, but it does it in a way that the author of the gospel assumes knowledge of the synoptics already. So when you read the Gospel of John, the author is already assuming that you're familiar with the events in the other three gospels. That's why he doesn't go into those again. That's why we see different stories in John's gospel that don't appear in the synoptics. Like the intro, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The bread of life discourse, Jesus' high priestly prayer, John 17, things like that. So the authorship of the gospel was attested early in church history by notable fathers such as Irenaeus. And however, with the rise of liberal theology, the authenticity of John the Apostle writing the gospel has come under question. Many of these questions of authorship came about in the 19th century, and like I said a moment ago, some persist. Some are still present today. This can be seen by prominent New Testament scholars such as Raymond Brown, who writes, quote, "As with the other Gospels, it is doubted by most scholars that the Gospel was written by the eyewitness of the public ministry of Jesus." Now, this by no means is discrediting Raymond Brown as a scholar. He's a brilliant scholar and he has said many great things. His opinion is a popular opinion out there, so we'll discuss that. That by no means is that discrediting the events inside the gospel, though. That's the key point. And like I said, I want to look at the various theories of authorship. I'll look at individuals such as a gentleman by the name of Brett Schneider, Strauss, a theory involving John the Elder, or was the author someone else from the Johannine community? And personally, my intent of the show is to show, using historical and biblical evidence, that the Apostle John is the likely author. So in the 19th century, there arose a firestorm of sorts when it came to those questioning the authenticity of John. Two of these men, there were two men, one by the name of Karl Bretschneider and the other David Strauss. Bretschneider published a work on the gospel and discussed reasons why John was not the author. He would later say that he never questioned the authenticity of the gospel, but questioned it to draw attention to it. It's actually pretty interesting. David Strauss took a somewhat different view, as he not only challenged authorship of the gospel, but also challenged its authenticity. So that's a key point. Just because someone may doubt that the Apostle John wrote it, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily doubting its authenticity. It's just as the case as Raymond Brown. In both cases, the 19th century challenge by the likes of Bretschneider and Strauss to the historical reliability of the gospel, given the marked differences between John and the synoptics, and the characteristically Johannine idiom of the discourses. So basically what they were doing is they were looking at the gospel itself, and they were maybe comparing it to the letters of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, which we'll actually get into a little bit later. And they were trying to say, is the Gospel of John similar in language, in verbiage, as these other ones? And because there was some difference, they were saying, no, there's no way that John could have wrote it. Now, in the case of Strauss, he saw the high Christology of John as a type of writing called myth. And for that reason, along with differences with the synoptics, he stated that it's the least reliable of the four gospel accounts. In the eyes of Strauss, the true Christ was a divine spirit which lives within all of us, and humanity should be regarded as the true Christ. This brought on the theory that the beloved disciple mentioned in the gospel is emblematic of all of us. Now, some scholars have evaluated the beloved disciple as pure symbol, created to model the perfect disciple, that he is never given a name, and that he appears alongside Peter in scenes known to us from the synoptics, where no such figure as mentioned had been invoked as proof of its non-historicity, if you will. According to Strauss, the stories of Christ's messiahship, miracles, and divinity were gradually added over time. And this type of theory persists today in people such as Bart Ehrman, for example. This can be seen in Strauss's work published in 1835 titled La Ben Jesu. Now, in this work, he details that the synoptics were part of the oral tradition, but over time, expectations of who the Messiah was supposed to be were added. They were added to strengthen the Christian movement, but they were using legend and myth to build up who Christ was. Now, regarding this, D.A. Carson writes, quote, Strauss, quote, he laid waste to the foundations of historical Christianity. In the views of these two men, it was not possible that the author of the gospel was John the Apostle. To do so would destroy their whole thesis as a historical Christian document. The author was anonymous, or a community of Christians who added legends to the synoptics wrote it. Another theory is that it was written by someone named John the Elder. And in his work Ecclesiastical History, the great church historian Eusebius distinguishes John the Elder from John the Apostle. And in this pivotal work, Eusebius writes, quote, where it is also proper to observe the name of John is twice mentioned, the former of which he mentions with Peter and James and Matthew and the other apostles, evidently meaning the evangelist, but in a separate point of his discourse he ranks the other John, with the rest not included in the number of the apostles, placing Aristian before him. He distinguishes him plainly by the name of presbyter. So per Eusebius, it was John the Elder who wrote the letters of 2nd and 3rd John. The above quote about John the Elder goes back to a statement given by the church father Papias. Papias possibly knew John, but we do know that he was a contemporary of Polycarp. The theory of authorship of John the Elder boils down to a couple key points. The first is that there is presumed to be a 2nd John named by Papias. Secondly, Eusebius states that the Elder is the author of 2nd and 3rd John. The language, grammar, and style are very similar to that of 1st John, and as a result, this author may have had some connection to the Gospel of John. Now, a few scholars today hold to the view that John the Elder wrote the Gospel. This is because an examination of the quote from Papias indicates that the term elder and apostle were used interchangeably. Thus, like I'm going to go over later, the quote from Papias will be further evidence for Johannine authorship. So there's another theory that says that the author of the Gospel was some random guy in the Johannine community. And this has gained traction over the past few decades. This theory insists that traditions from the community were written down over the life of the community. In this case, the Johannine community is a community of the beloved disciples. And generally this theory carries a later date of authorship, around 115 AD. So for this theory to work, basically they're saying that the gospel had to have been written about around 115 AD. But most scholars say that the gospel was written, maybe in the late 80s and early to mid 90s. And there's actually a piece of John's gospel, obviously not the original, but a portion of it that dates back to 125. So very early on. So one aspect of this theory that may seem strange to some is the influence of the person named the beloved disciple. As Raymond Brown states, quote, "The beloved disciple was a minor figure during the ministry of Jesus, too unimportant to be remembered in the more official tradition of the synoptics. This author was known to some of the readers of the gospel, but he chose to keep his identity a mystery. This figure was an important one in the Johannine community, and thus he became the figure in the Gospel of John. In this theory, one also must distinguish between the beloved disciple and the evangelist. The beloved disciple is the source of the Johannine tradition, and the evangelist may have been a disciple of the beloved disciple. In either case, it should not be assumed that one or the other were eyewitnesses to everything described in the gospel, although chapter 1, verse 14 and 16 say just that. Say that the author was an eyewitness. Now, the community may, at the teaching of Christ, it may have been received on on a spiritual level, rather than something that was physically being eyewitness to. Now, this theory has a few obvious issues that we have to address. Now, one thing that proponents of it do say is that it does not matter who wrote the gospel. Authorship is something that is secondary as the message is primary. Most scholars, even if they don't agree with the theory, will agree to this. The message is one of redemption and salvation of mankind, but there's still issues with the theory. The theory itself denies the overwhelming internal evidence that speaks for the authorship of John the Apostle. My apologies. Now, to strengthen the case against the theory, there's also extensive external evidence, including testimony from some of the most well-known early church fathers. So what's some of this internal evidence? So to discover who the author of the Gospel of John is, we have to look at the Gospel itself. Shocker, right? At the beginning of the Gospel, the author states, quote, The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory from the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. From the onset, there is a clear declaration that the author was also an eyewitness. A study in authorship is aided by John 21:20 and the mention of the beloved disciple writing the events down. So thus far, there is little differentiated from the Johannine community theory of authorship. From John 19:26-27, we see that the author is a direct witness to the crucifixion. The three at the foot of the cross were not merely minor characters in the drama of the Messiah, but they were mentioned throughout the gospel. One of them was Christ's own mother, the Blessed Virgin Mary. In the passages mentioned from chapter 19, Jesus tells John, "Behold your mother." As previously mentioned, a theme in the Johannine community theory of authorship is that the beloved disciple was a minor character. If Jesus perfectly fulfilled the law, would he relegate his mother to a minor character in his ministry? Not at all, because it had to be someone much more important. From reading the gospel account that the author is an apostle, we see that the author is an apostle, though he may be anonymous. He goes by the description, the one whom Jesus loved. He's listed among the 12 disciples, but is not Bartholomew, Judas Iscariot, Judas the son of James, Thomas, Philip, or Peter. A reading of John 21:2 reveals that he is one of the 7, but not Peter, Thomas, or Nathaniel. By doing this process of elimination, we can deduce that the author is one of the other disciples listed, or the son of Zebedee. These two individuals can then be compared to listings of the disciples in the Synoptic Gospels. In regards to this, scholar Andreas Kostenberger writes, quote, "Only the following apostles remain: Matthew, Simon the Zealot, James the son of Alphaeus, and John the son of Zebedee. In regards to Simon the Zealot, there is not a shred of evidence from history that associates him as the author of the gospel. The same can be said of James the son of Alphaeus. Matthew is already credited with the Gospel of Matthew, and that leaves John the son of Zebedee, or John the Apostle, as the likely author. So how about the external evidence? As there is no shortage of internal evidence, there's also no shortage of external evidence for John the Apostle being the author. The early church fathers were basically unanimous in their testimony of Johannine authorship. Now, the quote from Eusebius that I previously went over, in which he used John the Apostle and John the Elder synonymously, is pretty good evidence of this. Now, in his great work against heresies, Irenaeus specifically names John the Apostle as the author. The testimony of Irenaeus, is to be heard on its own. You see, but it comes with a link to the apostle himself. Irenaeus was a protege of Polycarp, who was a direct disciple of the apostle John. And so if Irenaeus says John the Apostle wrote it, he heard that from Polycarp, who was taught personally by John the Apostle. Clement of Alexandria oversaw the famed catechetical school in Alexandria, Egypt. And he also believed that the book was authored by John. To this effect, Eusebius writes, quote, "John, last of all, composed a spiritual gospel." Now, the great Polycarp is quoted as telling Irenaeus, quote, "John, the disciple of the Lord, who had also leaned upon his breast, had himself published a gospel during his residence in Ephesus in Asia. Now, as I previously stated, Polycarp was taught directly by the Apostle John. It's highly unlikely that he would be creating such a fable in the 2nd century. Now that, along with other patristic evidence, points to the authenticity of Johannine authorship. Other notable church fathers, such as Tertullian, also confirm what was stated by Irenaeus and Polycarp. Now, so far, the external evidence overwhelmingly supports the conclusion that the Apostle John is the author of the Gospel. But I want to provide one more piece of evidence. The early church historian Eusebius also directly names John as the author. Like I said again a moment ago, in his work Ecclesiastical History, he writes, quote, "They say that John, who during all this time was proclaiming the gospel without writing, at length proceeded to write it on the following occasion." Guys, the whole purpose of this show today is to prove that the Gospel of John was written by John the Apostle. Liberal theologians have categorized the Gospel as a myth and not historically reliable. But the external evidence proves that theory wrong. A look at the possibility of John the Elder being the author, we went over that. But we see that Eusebius used elder and apostle interchangeably. We looked at the theory of the Johannine community authoring the work, but history rejects that. It was rejected because the internal evidence shows that the author was not a minor figure, but someone in Jesus' inner circle. Because of that whole "behold your mother" comment. The internal and external evidence support the idea that John the Apostle authored the Gospel. This was also the belief in the first centuries of the church, and that's highly attested to using writings from the church fathers. And though it may seem arbitrary, this debate does go on in some circles. But the evidence, in my opinion, is overwhelming. The evidence for John the Apostle being the author is clear. So, you may be, as you listen to this, you may say, is this really important? Is John the Apostle being the author really important? In my opinion, it is important. Because it brings to mind, is the Bible reliable? Now, don't get me wrong, the message within the message of the Gospel of John, first and foremost, is more important than the author. By no means am I saying that it's secondary. But it's important to... John the Apostle being the author is important from a historical point of view. Okay. The Gospel of John is the one that's always picked on this time of year as being non-reliable, as stories being tacked on to pump up the Christian's view of who Jesus was. But the evidence is clear. Look for yourself. If you don't believe me? Go to my website, williamhemsworth.com, and search for the authorship of John's Gospel. I have 37 sources lined up for you to look at that prove my case about why the Gospel by the Apostle John is the author of the Gospel. It's important because those who deny the authorship of John, with rare exceptions such as Raymond Brown, who's a great New Testament scholar, those who normally deny it also deny the divinity of Christ. So it kind of becomes a Christological issue in a way. That's why it's important. Well, guys, we come to the end of my time here on KKMC. I thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode of Deep in Church History. Hope you learned a little something about the authorship of John's Gospel. Hope it benefits you in some way. Guys, please visit my website, williamhemsworth.com. If you want to support the cause, the show is listener supported. Visit my Patreon page, patreon.com, William Hemsworth. No matter how much you donate, you get a free gift over there. Guys, Merry Christmas. Have a great weekend. Have a safe holiday. And we'll catch you next Friday on Deep in Church History. God bless you.